My name is Chloe Vance, and I am 28 years old, though in the eyes of the people sitting across from me at this mahogany table, I have remained frozen in time as the family disappointment. We were sitting in the private dining room of the Gilded Oak in downtown Boston, a place where the tasting menu starts at $300 per person, and the silence is thick with the scent of expensive truffle oil and old inherited arrogance. My father, Julian Vance, a man whose entire personality is constructed from the prestige of his tenure as a senior partner at one of the city's most aggressive hedge funds, was currently staring at me with a look of profound theatrical disbelief. "You applied to MIT," he wheezed, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of burgundy as he choked on a $140 mouthful of 2012 Silver Oak Merlot. The sound of his coughing was the only thing breaking the suffocating refinement of the room until he slammed his Waterford crystal wine glass onto the table with a violent force that sent a shudder through the heavy wood and caused the sterling silver forks to rattle against the fine bone china. "That is the funniest thing I have heard all week, Chloe," he managed to gasp out, wiping a stray drop of red wine from his silk Hermes tie with a linen napkin that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Stick to flipping burgers or whatever it is you do in that depressing little cubicle of yours." Across from me, my older sister Jessica tossed her head, her hair perfectly highlighted to the tune of $600 at a salon on Newbury Street, letting the blonde waves fall perfectly over the shoulders of her $4,000 Chanel tweed jacket. She didn't even look up from her plate, where she was meticulously cutting a tiny piece of medium rare of 5 Wagyu steak that had been flown in from Japan. "Please, even I would not aim that high, and everyone knows I am the smart one," she smirked, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that she had perfected since we were children. Jessica had always been the golden child, the one who received the private tutors, the equestrian lessons, and the unconditional pride of a father who saw her as a mirror image of his own ambition. I was just the background noise, the daughter who had struggled with a chronic illness in high school and had been written off as a lost cause the moment my grades dipped below a perfect 4.0. They had no idea that while they were busy spending thousands on Jessica's third attempt at a graduate degree she would never finish, I had been working 80-hour weeks, teaching myself advanced Python and linear algebra after my shifts at a local logistics firm, and saving every cent of my meager $38,000 salary to fund a dream they had tried to bury. The air in the restaurant was cool, circulating with a sterile precision from the high-tech HVAC system hidden behind the ornate crown molding, but I could feel a prickle of heat rising up my neck. I looked at my father's hands, manicured and steady now as he refilled his glass, the light from the Swarovski chandelier overhead catching the gold of his Patek Philippe Calatrava, a watch that retailed for nearly $40,000. He lived in a world of tangible, expensive certainties, and in his world, I was a rounding error. But I wasn't just Chloe, the girl who worked in a cubicle anymore. I was the person who had spent the last 3 years building a proprietary algorithmic model for supply chain optimization in my spare time, using a refurbished Dell Latitude laptop I'd bought off eBay for $200. I had lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a neighborhood they wouldn't even drive through, eating canned tuna and generic brand pasta so I could afford the application fees and the specialized certifications required to even be considered by a committee at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The mockery at the table continued, a rhythmic back and forth between my father and sister that felt like a rehearsed performance. My mother, Eleanor, sat quietly to my father's right, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her sparkling water. She wore a string of Mikimoto pearls that gleamed with a soft, iridescent luster, a gift for their 30th anniversary. She didn't defend me. She never did. She just adjusted her posture, her spine a rigid line of practiced suburban submission. "Julian, perhaps we should talk about the summer house renovation instead," she whispered, trying to steer the conversation away from the conflict, but my father wasn't done. "No, Eleanor, I want to hear more about this fantasy," he said, leaning forward, the scent of his expensive cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and arrogance filling the space between us. How exactly do you plan to pay for a master's at MIT, Chloe? With the tips from your paper route? You realize the tuition and fees alone for the program you are talking about are nearly $80,000 a year, not to mention the cost of living in Cambridge. I am not signing any loans for a delusion. I already told you, the trust fund money is tied up in Jessica's business venture. Jessica's business venture was a luxury candle line that had already burned through $200,000 of family money without turning a single cent of profit. She nodded in agreement, her lips curved into a tiny, self-satisfied pout as she sipped her wine. It is about being realistic, Chloe, she added. Some people are meant to lead and some people are meant to support. There is no shame in being a secretary for the rest of your life. It is a stable career for someone with your limited stamina. I felt the weight of the FedEx envelope in my leather tote bag resting against my calf under the table. It was a heavy cardboard mailer, the kind that carried documents of significant legal or academic weight. Inside that envelope was a letter of acceptance and a full tuition fellowship award totaling $92,000 for the first year, including a research stipend that would pay me more than my current annual salary just to study. I hadn't told them I had already been accepted. I hadn't told them that my model had caught the attention of a venture capital scout who was already talking about a seed round of 7 figures. I had invited them to dinner tonight under the guise of an early birthday celebration for my father, but really, it was an execution. I wanted to see the exact moment the floor fell out from under their feet. I reached down and gripped the handle of my bag, my knuckles turning white. The restaurant was filled with the low hum of other wealthy patrons, the soft clink of silver on porcelain, and the distant rhythmic sound of a jazz pianist playing in the lounge. Outside the frosted windows, the Boston winter was beginning to bite, a light dusting of snow falling onto the black pavement of Boylston Street, where valet drivers moved 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Classes and Range Rovers with practiced efficiency. I thought about my own car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper and a heater that only worked on every third Tuesday, parked 3 blocks away in a public garage because I couldn't afford the $30 valet fee. The contrast between my life and theirs was a canyon they had dug and spent 2 decades widening. But getting ahead of myself is a habit I am trying to break. To understand why this moment felt like oxygen after 20 years of drowning, you have to understand the sheer, calculated coldness of the Vance household. When I was 19 and the medical bills from my complications with Lyme disease started piling up, my father sat me down in his cherry wood-paneled office and showed me a spreadsheet. He pointed to a cell highlighted in red. "This is your cost-to-benefit ratio, Chloe," he had said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "You are currently a liability. Jessica is an asset. We invest in assets." He had cut off my college fund that day, forcing me to drop out of my sophomore year while Jessica was sent on a 6-month recovery trip to the Amalfi Coast because she felt burnt out from her elective ceramics classes. Now, as I watched him swirl the deep red liquid in his glass, observing the legs of the wine as they coated the crystal, I realized that he truly believed I was beneath his notice. He thought I was here to beg. He thought the mention of MIT was a pathetic attempt to garner his attention or his money. He didn't realize that I didn't want his money anymore. I wanted his silence. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that the daughter he had discarded was about to become the most successful person to ever carry his last name. I reached into my bag and pulled out the white and purple envelope. I didn't say a word. I simply slid it across the mahogany table, past the bread basket filled with artisanal sourdough, past the salted French butter, and let it rest right in front of his wine glass. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the restaurant. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. My father looked down at the envelope, his brow furrowed in confusion. Jessica paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the return address. My mother stopped breathing altogether. The FedEx tracking label was crisp, the date of delivery clearly marked. I watched my father's thick fingers, adorned with his heavy gold signet ring, reach out and tear the perforated strip. The sound of the cardboard ripping was loud, a jagged noise that seemed to echo off the wood paneling and the oil paintings of fox hunts on the walls. He pulled out the thick stack of papers, the MIT crest embossed in gold at the top of the first page. I watched his eyes move. First they moved with a dismissive speed, then they slowed down. They stopped at the word, "Congratulations." Then they moved to the section titled Financial Support and Fellowship Award. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, then go slack. The burgundy flush in his face began to fade, replaced by a pale, sickly gray. He didn't speak. He just stared at the number 92,000, followed by the words, "fully funded." Jessica leaned over, her curiosity overcoming her practiced indifference. "What is it? Dad, what does it say?" She snatched the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the text with a frantic energy. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the letter, then at me, then back at the letter. "This has to be a mistake," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "There is no way you got a fellowship. I applied to the MBA program there 3 years ago and didn't even get an interview, and I had better internships than you." I took a slow sip of my tap water, the cold liquid soothing the dry tightness in my throat. "It is not a mistake, Jessica," I said, my voice calm and steady, echoing with a confidence I had spent 5 years building in the dark. "I didn't just apply to the school, I submitted my algorithmic framework to the department head. They didn't just accept me, they are paying me to be there. And as for the money, Dad, you can keep the trust fund. You can keep the summer house and the silver oak. I don't need a single cent from a man who views his children as line items on a balance sheet." The waiter arrived then, carrying a silver tray with our main courses, but the air at the table had turned to lead. My father looked at me, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't see disappointment or mockery in his eyes. I saw something far more satisfying. I saw fear. He realized that the daughter he had tried to erase was the only one who had actually inherited his intellect, but none of his loyalty. He had spent his life building a wall of wealth to keep the world out, never realizing he was locking himself in with the wrong child. Family is not the name on a birth certificate, or the person who pays the bills when it is convenient. Family is the people who see your value when you have nothing to offer but your potential. And sitting at this table, I realized I was officially an orphan of my own making. And it was the most beautiful feeling in the world. In the affluent and meticulously manicured suburbs of Lake Forest, Illinois, where the lawns are cut to a precise 2.5 inches and the silence is only broken by the distant hum of high-end German engineering, our house was never a home, but rather a cold and calculated corporate ladder that I was never invited to climb. My father, Richard Vance, was a man who measured the success of a human soul by the quarterly growth of his boutique marketing firm, an agency that boasted over $4.2 million in annual billing and specialized in selling the illusion of perfection to people who could already afford it. He moved through our 5,200-square-foot colonial with the detached air of a CEO visiting a satellite office that was underperforming, his eyes always scanning for a flaw in the paint or a smudge on the glass that might suggest we were anything less than the pinnacle of upper-middle-class achievement. My mother, Susan, was his willing accomplice in this charade, a woman who had transitioned from a career in high-end real estate to becoming a full-time curator of our family's optics, ensuring that every corner of our lives looked like a spread from Architectural Digest. She had recently overseen a $15,000 renovation of our kitchen, installing Taj Mahal quartzite countertops and a custom-integrated Sub-Zero refrigerator that hummed with a soft, expensive vibration, and she took it as a personal affront if I so much as breathed near the polished surfaces. Then there was Jessica, my older sister, and the undisputed golden child of the Vance dynasty, a girl whose existence was a continuous loop of rewards for mediocre efforts while I was treated as the invisible disappointment who didn't fit the brand. I remember the day the disparity became a physical weight in my chest, a Tuesday afternoon in late spring when Jessica came home with a C- in her honors biology class, a grade that would have resulted in a week-long interrogation and the confiscation of my phone had it been mine. Instead of a lecture, my father looked at her tear-stained face, tears that were more about the inconvenience of the grade than any actual academic regret, and decided that her fragile self-esteem was the most valuable asset in the house. That weekend, he drove her to the local dealership and bought her a $42,000 2023 Audi Q5 in ibis white with nougat brown leather interior, claiming that a reliable and prestigious vehicle would give her the confidence she needed to focus on her studies. I watched from the window of my second-story bedroom, the one with the drafty window and the faded carpet, as she squealed and wrapped her arms around him, the keys to her new life dangling from her manicured fingers. Meanwhile, my reality was defined by the acrid, clinging scent of industrial-strength bleach and the heavy, cloying odor of old canola oil that seemed to seep into my very pores. While Jessica was driving her Audi to the country club, I was working 28 hours a week at a greasy, high-volume diner on the edge of town called the Rusty Spoon, a place where the floor was always slightly tacky and the customers were mostly truckers and tired night shift workers. I spent my Friday nights and Saturday mornings scrubbing griddles with a wire brush and hauling heavy plastic buckets of mop water until my back ached and my hands were raw and red from the chemicals. I wasn't working for fun or for pocket money to buy the latest designer sneakers. I was working with a desperate, singular focus to save exactly $10,432. That was the precise amount I needed for a high-performance, refurbished Dell Precision mobile workstation and the specific software licenses required for the advanced data modeling projects I was secretly building in the dead of night. To my mother, my presence in her pristine kitchen was an aesthetic disaster that she felt the need to manage like a PR crisis. I had learned to navigate the house like a ghost, wearing baggy, oversized thrift store hoodies in charcoal gray or dull navy to hide the fact that I didn't own a single piece of the Lululemon or Alo yoga gear that Jessica wore like a uniform. My mother would watch me walk toward the mudroom to leave for my shift, her eyes narrowing as they took in my worn-out sneakers and the slight sheen of grease on my forehead. "Chloe, must you walk through the foyer looking like a vagrant?" she would ask, her voice a sharp, polished blade that cut through the air. "I have guests coming over for the charity auction committee meeting at 4, and the last thing I need is for them to see you looking like you just crawled out of a storm drain." She would then adjust the placement of a $300 diptyque baize candle on the entryway console, as if the scent of blackcurrant and roses could mask the fact that her younger daughter was a blue-collar laborer in a white-collar fortress. The contrast between our lives was so stark, it was almost comical, yet nobody in that house seemed to find it strange that one daughter was gifted a luxury SUV, while the other was forced to buy her own basic necessities from a paycheck earned over a deep fryer. My father's marketing firm specialized in storytelling, in creating narratives that people wanted to believe in, and the narrative he had created for our family simply did not have a role for me. I was the statistical outlier, the daughter who had struggled with the cognitive fog of a long-term illness in my teens and had therefore been relegated to the scrap heap of his expectations. In his mind, I was a liability, a drain on the family's carefully curated image of effortless success. He didn't see the grit it took to wake up at 4 a.m. to study complex algorithms before my 8 a.m. shift at the diner, nor did he care about the meticulous spreadsheets I kept to track every penny of my $10,000 goal. He only saw the grease on my apron and the lack of a prestigious internship on my resume. Every night after the diner closed and I had finished the grueling task of cleaning the grease traps, an activity that left me smelling so strongly of old fries and chemicals that I had to wash my hair 3 times just to feel human again, I would sit at my small, cluttered desk and count my savings. I kept the money in a locked metal box hidden under a loose floorboard in the back of my closet, tucked away behind a stack of old textbooks and a pair of winter boots I'd had since sophomore year of high school. It was a slow, painful process, watching the balance grow $20 at a time, $50 on a good night when the tips were generous. I remember the night I finally hit the $8,000 mark. I sat on the floor of my closet, the dim light of a clip-on reading lamp illuminating the stack of crumpled $5 and $10 bills, and I felt a sense of triumph that was more profound than anything Jessica had ever experienced in her gifted Audi. That money represented my autonomy. It was the down payment on a life where my father's marketing billing and my mother's kitchen optics would no longer have the power to define me. Living in that house was like being a character in a movie who had been edited out of all the wide shots, only appearing in the background of someone else's scene to provide a moment of tension or contrast. At dinner, the conversation was a one-way street where my father would recount the triumphs of his firm. The new accounts won, the competitors crushed, the brilliant campaigns that had secured another year of $4 million revenue, and my mother would chime in with updates on the social hierarchy of Lake Forest. Jessica would complain about the sound system in her Audi or the difficulty of her elective art history course, and they would listen with rapt attention, offering advice and accolades. When I tried to speak, to mention a project I was working on or even just a funny observation from the diner, the air would go still, as if I had interrupted a symphony with a discordant note. They would look at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance before my father would clear his throat and pivot the conversation back to Jessica's upcoming trip to Cabo or the new landscaping plans for the backyard. I learned to find a perverse kind of power in being invisible, in knowing that while they were focused on the surface of things, I was building a foundation they couldn't even see. The industrial bleach and the canola oil became my armor, a physical reminder of the distance between their pampered delusions and the reality of the work I was doing. I knew that the $10,432 was just the beginning. I knew that the refurbished Dell laptop was more than just a computer. It was a weapon I was going to use to dismantle the entire hierarchy of the Vance household. I spent my hours at the diner not just cleaning and serving, but observing the logistics of the business, the inefficiencies in the supply chain, and the way the data of everyday life could be captured and optimized. I was a scientist in a grease-stained apron, a coder in a thrift store hoodie, and I was counting down the days until I could stop being the disappointment and start being the architect of their downfall. Every time my mother sighed at my appearance or my father laughed at the idea of me achieving anything significant, I just gripped the handle of my mop a little tighter and reminded myself of the number in my metal box, a silent tally of the cost of my eventual freedom and the price they would one day pay for their blindness. The betrayal did not come with a scream or a sudden burst of violence, but rather with the cold, calculated precision of a financial execution that occurred on a Tuesday evening at exactly 7:04 p.m. We were gathered in the formal dining room, a space used only for high-stakes family optics, or, as it turned out, for the dismantling of my soul, beneath the dim amber glow of the $1,200 restoration hardware chandelier. My father had called what he termed a mandatory meeting, a phrase he usually reserved for his underperforming junior associates at the marketing firm, and the air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and the lingering aroma of the rosemary-crusted rack of lamb we had just finished consuming in a suffocating, tense silence. Jessica sat to my left, her lower lip trembling in a practiced theatrical display of remorse, her fingers nervously twisting a gold Cartier love bracelet that had been a reward for simply graduating high school, while my mother sat at the far end of the table, meticulously smoothing a silk table runner as if the alignment of the fabric could somehow stabilize the crumbling reputation of her golden child. The truth had finally caught up with the family's narrative. Jessica had officially failed out of her $65,000 a year private university in Southern California after 3 semesters of academic probation and 0 credits earned in her major. It wasn't just that she was struggling with the curriculum. It was the revelation that she had systematically drained her tuition account to fund a lavish $10,000 sorority retreat to Cabo San Lucas and a walk-in wardrobe filled with Gucci Marmont handbags and Prada loafers that now sat in the trunk of her Audi Q5. I expected an explosion, a lecture on the value of $1, or perhaps the repossession of her car keys. But as I watched my father lean over the heavy mahogany table, His eyes were not filled with rage toward Jessica, but with a predatory, cold focus directed entirely at me. He adjusted his cufflink, a small silver square that caught the light, and cleared his throat with a sound that felt like gravel grinding against glass before he spoke the words that would ignite the fuse of my rebellion. "Chloe," he began, his voice dropping into that deep, authoritative register he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, "your sister has hit a minor speed bump, and as a family, we protect our own, which is why we have decided that you will be making a necessary adjustment to your plans. You are going to withdraw your applications to those 4-year universities and enroll in the local community college instead, because frankly, your academic ceiling has always been lower, and it makes more financial sense to consolidate our resources." Then came the true blade to the heart, the part of the plan that made the bile rise in my throat as he leaned in closer, the smell of his expensive scotch wafting across the table. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a tax write-off, "you will transfer the $10,432 currently sitting in your savings account into Jessica's personal checking account by tomorrow morning to cover the outstanding debt she owes the university bursar so we can keep this entire embarrassing ordeal off the public record. It is a family sacrifice, Chloe, and since you've been working those extra shifts at that diner, I'm sure you understand the importance of hard work and contributing to the collective good of the Vance name." The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room until I felt lightheaded, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at my mother, searching for a flicker of maternal instinct, a sign that she would defend the girl who had scrubbed grease off floorboards for 2 years to save every penny of that money. But she simply looked down at her polished fingernails and nodded in silent agreement. I looked at Jessica, who had stopped her fake crying and was now watching me with a sharp, expectant glint in her eyes, already mentally spending the money I had bled for. When the word no finally left my lips, it sounded small at first, a fragile defiance in the face of their monolithic arrogance, but as I repeated it, my voice grew steadier, echoing off the high ceilings and the framed oil paintings of ancestors who would have undoubtedly approved of this theft. "No," I said again, my grip tightening on the edge of the table until the wood dug into my palms. "That is my money, earned from 28 hours a week of manual labor while Jessica was drinking margaritas on a beach, and I am not giving up my future to subsidize her catastrophic failure." That was when the laughter started. Not a hearty, warm sound, but a soul-crushing, mocking chorus of derision that felt like being pelted with jagged stones. My father threw his head back, a short, barking laugh escaping his throat, while Jessica let out a sharp, condescending titter, covering her mouth with a hand adorned in a $300 manicure. "You? A future?" Jessica gasped between giggles, her eyes dancing with a cruel, vibrant light. "Chloe, you're an invisible waitress who smells like a deep fryer half the time. What exactly do you think you're going to do with $10,000 that's more important than saving the family's reputation? Your lucky dad is even letting you stay in this house after you've spent the last 3 years looking like a charity case in those disgusting hoodies." My father's laughter died down, replaced by a smile that was far more terrifying, a thin, predatory line that signaled the end of the negotiation and the beginning of the siege. "You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice here," he whispered, his voice dangerously low as he stood up, his 6'2" frame casting a long, dark shadow over my chair. "You are 28 years old, living under my roof, eating my food and using my electricity. If you refuse to contribute to this family in its time of need, then I will make sure you understand the true cost of independence." He leaned down until his face was inches from mine, and I could see the broken capillaries in his nose and the absolute lack of empathy in his pupils. "If that money isn't moved by tomorrow, I will refuse to sign your FAFSA forms. I will withhold any and all financial documentation required for your financial aid, and I will effectively bankrupt your academic future before it even starts. You want to play at being an adult, Chloe? Then start paying like one. transfer the funds, or find a new place to sleep tonight, because I will not have a parasite under my roof who values a few $1,000s over her sister's dignity. The sheer, staggering injustice of it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, a realization that to these people, I was not a daughter or a sister, but a resource to be harvested, a backup battery to be drained whenever the golden child blew a fuse. My mother finally looked up, her expression one of weary disappointment, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Chloe, don't be dramatic," she sighed, reaching for her glass of sparkling San Pellegrino. "It's just community college. You'll have plenty of time to save up again, and it's not like you were going to some Ivy League school anyway. Let's just resolve this so we can move on with our lives." I looked around the room, at the $15,000 kitchen renovations visible through the arched doorway, at the $4.2 million annual billing my father bragged about, at the $42,000 Audi parked in the driveway, and I realized that they weren't asking for my money because they needed it. They were taking it because they wanted to break me. They wanted to ensure that I stayed in my place, the invisible disappointment, the servant who provided the labor so they could maintain the luxury. They thought I was too stupid to have a contingency plan, too weak to weather the storm they were intentionally creating. But as I sat there, listening to the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant sound of a neighbor's leaf blower, a strange, cold clarity settled over me. They didn't know about the FedEx envelope. They didn't know about the $92,000 fellowship that was already waiting for me at MIT, a program that didn't require a FAFSA signature because they were paying me to attend. They didn't know that the $10,432 in my hidden metal box was no longer my tuition fund. It was my escape velocity. I realized in that moment that the man sitting across from me, the man who was willing to destroy his younger daughter's life to hide his older daughter's laziness, was not a father. He was a hollow shell held together by brand names and ego. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking but my heart hardening into something resembling industrial steel. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I looked him dead in the eye, ignoring the mocking smirk still plastered on Jessica's face, and I realized that the $140 mouthful of Merlot he had choked on earlier was just the beginning of the bitterness he was going to taste. "Family sacrifice?" I whispered, the words feeling like a vow. "You have no idea what I'm willing to sacrifice to make sure I never have to look at any of you ever again." I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of their renewed laughter following me up the stairs, a jagged, ugly sound that I would hold on to for every hour of the long, cold night ahead as I packed my life into 2 duffel bags and prepared to vanish into the future they were so certain I didn't have. They thought they were closing a door on me, but all they had done was remove the last reason I had to stay. By the time the sun rose over Lake Forest, the $10,000 would still be mine, and the Vance family would finally realize that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I spent the remainder of that suffocating night confined within the narrow, wood-paneled walls of my 120-square-foot bedroom, a space that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a holding cell in the fortress my parents had built. The air in the room was stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of the industrial bleach that had become my secondary skin from the double shifts at the diner, and the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the Lake Forest estate was the rhythmic, labored hum of my clunky, refurbished Dell laptop. I did not cry, because tears are a luxury afforded to those who believe their sorrow might actually move someone to action. And I had learned years ago that in the Vance household, vulnerability was merely a weakness to be exploited by my father's predatory instincts. Instead of weeping, I sat at my cramped laminate desk, a piece of furniture my mother had tried to replace 3 times because its scuffed edges ruined the upstairs aesthetic, and I pulled up a master Excel spreadsheet that I had titled Project Kinetic. I began to populate 2 columns with a cold, surgical detachment that would have made my father proud if he weren't the target of it. Column A was labeled Their Expectations, and it was a bleak, empty void of 0 expectations, zero belief in my intellect, and a total assumption of my ultimate subservience. Column B was labeled My Reality, and it was a sprawling, complex map of every hour I had stolen from the night and every cent I had hidden from their greed. I realized in the blue light of that flickering screen that I had already successfully bypassed the entire federal financial aid system that my father was currently using as a leash to choke my ambitions. He thought that by refusing to sign my FAFSA and withholding his tax returns from the 2023 fiscal year, he could effectively terminate my academic career and force me into a state of permanent financial indentured servitude to Jessica's failures. What he didn't know, what none of them knew while they were sipping $15 martinis at the Shoreline Country Club, was that I had bypassed the government entirely by applying for the Turing Bowers Fellowship. This was a privately funded elite merit award specifically designed for independent researchers in computational logistics, and the selection committee didn't care about my father's $4.2 million annual billing or his petulant refusal to provide a signature. They only cared about the 14,000 lines of predictive retail code I had meticulously written in the dark, a proprietary algorithmic framework that analyzed supply chain disruptions with a 98% accuracy rate. While Jessica was blowing her tuition on leather handbags and beach clubs, I had been building a digital engine that was worth more than the entire marketing firm my father was so desperate to protect. The realization settled over me like a cold front moving across Lake Michigan. Blood is not a bond. It is merely a biological coincidence, a shared set of genetic markers that carries no inherent obligation of loyalty or love. I looked at the closed door of my room, hearing the distant, muffled sound of my sister's laughter coming from the hallway. Likely she was already on the phone with one of her friends, bragging about how she had managed to fix her little money problem at my expense. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace as I decided to let them keep believing I was defeated, to let them bask in the glow of their perceived victory until the very second the trap I had set snapped shut around their ankles. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously moving my digital life to a secure cloud server and double-checking the final submission for the fellowship, my fingers moving across the worn keys of the Dell with a speed born of years of practice. I had lived as the invisible disappointment for 28 years, a ghost in a house of mirrors, and I knew exactly how to maintain the facade of the broken, compliant daughter for a few weeks longer. Every time my father walked past me in the kitchen over the next few days, he wore a smirk of supreme satisfaction, the kind of expression a man wears when he believes he has successfully broken a wild horse. He would talk about the community college registration deadlines as if he were doing me a favor, all while I was receiving encrypted emails from Cambridge confirming that my technical interview had been fast-tracked. I would look down at my chipped nails and nod, playing the part of the girl whose spirit had been crushed by the $10,000 theft he had orchestrated. It was a performance of high-stakes theater, a silent war of attrition where the ammunition was data and the battlefield was a mahogany dining table. I knew that the $900 monthly rent on my new apartment in Somerville was already covered by the research stipend attached to the fellowship, but I continued to wear my grease-stained diner apron and my baggy thrift store hoodies like a camouflage. I wanted them to be completely blindsided by the reality of who I had become. I wanted the shock to be so absolute that it would leave a permanent scar on their collective ego. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Lake Forest mansions looked like tombstones under the silver moonlight, I would go back to my 14,000 lines of code, refining the logic and hardening the security protocols. This wasn't just about a degree anymore. It was about the total reclamation of my identity from a family that had tried to turn me into a footnote. My father's marketing firm relied on the idea that people are easily manipulated by symbols of status and authority, but he had failed to realize that I had spent my entire life studying his methods of manipulation from the outside. I knew his weaknesses better than he did, his obsession with optics, his fear of being seen as a failure, his absolute reliance on the Vance name as a shield against the world. I was going to strip all of that away, not with a loud confrontation, but with the quiet, inevitable force of a mathematical certainty. The $65,000 he had wasted on Jessica was just the deposit on the lesson I was about to teach him. As I looked at the spreadsheet one last time before closing the lid of my laptop, I saw the final calculation of my exit strategy. It was a work of art, a chronological countdown to the moment I would disappear from their lives forever, taking my intellect and my future with me. I would not give them the satisfaction of an argument. I would not give them the closure of a goodbye. I would simply be gone, and in my place would be a void that no amount of quartzite countertops or luxury SUVs could ever fill. I realized then that the most powerful thing a person can do is to succeed in the very silence their enemies tried to use to bury them. I was no longer the girl who smelled like canola oil and disappointment. I was a high-functioning anomaly in their perfect system, a variable they had failed to account for, and the countdown to their obsolescence had already begun. The $92,000 secret was safe for now, tucked away in the digital ether, waiting for the precise moment to detonate. I lay back on my thin mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to the hum of the house, knowing that the family I was born into was already a ghost of the past, and the woman I was becoming was someone they would never be allowed to know. The silence of the house usually felt heavy and suffocating, but that night it felt like an ally, a cloak that allowed me to move and plan without detection. I thought about the Waterford crystal glasses and the silver oak Merlot, symbols of a life built on the exploitation of others, and I knew that I was the first Vance in 3 generations to actually build something of substance from nothing. My father's pride was a fragile thing, built on the shifting sands of client billing and social standing, but my pride was made of 14,000 lines of logic that would still be true even if the family fortune turned to ash. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I visualized the moment I would walk out the front door for the last time, my 2 duffel bags packed with the only things that mattered, my laptop, my documents, and my dignity. I was ready for the trap to snap. I was ready to be the one holding the keys to the cage. By the time Jessica realized that her $10,000 infusion was a temporary Band-Aid on a gushing wound of her own making, I would be 300 miles away, sitting in a lecture hall where my name was spoken with respect rather than mockery. I closed my eyes, the ghost of a smile touching my lips as I finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that for the first time in my life, I was the one in control of the narrative. Family isn't who shares your home, it's who shares your values. And as of 7:04 p.m. on that Tuesday, I officially had no family at all, and I had never felt more alive. For the next 92 days, I became a ghost inhabiting a shell of my former self, meticulously playing the part of the broken servant in a household that thrived on my perceived submission. Every morning began at exactly 5:15 a.m., long before the sun had even considered cresting over the manicured tree line of Lake Forest, as the cold blue light of my smartphone screen illuminated my face while I checked my encrypted email for updates from the MIT admissions office and the Turing Bowers Fellowship Committee. I moved through the 5,200-square-foot colonial with a quiet, practiced invisibility, dodging the casual, razor-sharp insults my father threw my way about my supposed community college brains and my lack of ambition. Richard would sit at the head of the Taj Mahal quartzite island in the kitchen, sipping a $3 an ounce pour of Kona coffee, and lecture me on how my cognitive ceiling was the reason I was destined for a life of service, while Jessica sat nearby, scrolling through luxury travel blogs on her newest iPad Pro. To ensure my paper trail remained a complete mystery to them, I had hired a high-end private courier service for $300 a month to intercept any physical mail addressed to me at a secure P.O. box in downtown Chicago. Yet the tension remained nearly unbearable because I knew that even one slip-up would compromise the $92,000 secret I was carrying. Despite my meticulous planning, I did miss one delivery, a small, nondescript windowed envelope that had somehow slipped through the cracks and landed in our communal brass mailbox, forcing me to sprint down the driveway in my pajamas at 6 a.m. to retrieve it before my mother, Susan, could begin her daily ritual of sorting the mail into piles of importance. I spent my grueling 10-hour shifts at the Rusty Spoon Diner not just serving lukewarm coffee and greasy hash browns to commuters, but mentally calculating the exact moment of impact for the truth I was preparing to detonate. The smell of industrial bleach and old canola oil became my meditation, a pungent reminder of the work I had put into my freedom. And with every $20 tip I tucked into my apron, I felt the weight of my digital arsenal growing heavier and more lethal. That arsenal was now fully loaded and ready for deployment. I had a high-resolution digital copy of my MIT acceptance letter secured in a biometric-locked folder, a pre-signed and notarized lease for a 700-square-foot loft in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that cost $3,200 a month, and a specialized bank account at a boutique tech-focused firm that my father's forensic accountants couldn't touch even if they tried. While I played the role of the daughter who had been humbled by her own failure, I watched with a detached anthropological fascination as my parents spent $25,000 on a lavish, over-the-top 60th birthday bash for my father. They spared no expense, ordering $3,000 worth of floral arrangements consisting of rare black calla lilies and white orchids, and hiring a catering team that charged $150 per head to serve lobster medallions and truffle-infused risotto. The night of the party, they invited 50 of the city's most influential executives, the kind of men who wore six-figure watches and spoke in the hushed, arrogant tones of those who owned the world, and all while the champagne flowed, they treated me like the hired help. My mother had actually pulled me aside that morning and handed me a plain black dress, instructing me to stay in the kitchen and assist the catering staff with the hors d'oeuvres, because she didn't want the guests asking awkward questions about what her younger daughter was doing with her life. I stood in the background of my own home, carrying silver trays of Wagyu beef sliders and duck confit spring rolls, watching my father boast about Jessica's upcoming internship at a friend's consulting firm, an internship he had bought for her with a $10,000 donation to their favorite charity. He stood there in his custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, which retailed for nearly $6,000, laughing with a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon in his hand, telling the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company how proud he was of his eldest daughter's resilience. Every time our eyes met, he gave me a look of profound, dismissive pity, as if I were a smudge on his perfect evening that needed to be buffed away, never realizing that the girl holding the tray was the only one in the room who truly understood the mathematical foundations of the very markets they spent their lives trying to manipulate. The irony of the situation was a cold, sharp blade that I kept tucked away in the back of my mind, knowing that in just a few weeks, the narrative of the Vance family would be rewritten by my hand alone. I listened to the jazz quartet they had hired for $4,000 play smooth, soulless renditions of standards in the foyer, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and the expensive oil paintings that my mother had curated to project an image of old-world sophistication. I watched Jessica, dressed in a $2,000 shimmering cocktail dress, flirt with the sons of my father's business associates, her laughter a shrill, artificial sound that cut through the refined atmosphere like a jagged piece of metal. She had already spent the $10,000 I had been forced to transfer to her, buying a limited-edition Chanel bag and paying off the remainder of her sorority fines. And she looked at me with a smug, triumphant grin every time I passed her with a tray of empty glasses. They were so blinded by their own theater that they couldn't see the fire I was building right under their feet, or the fact that my laptop, hidden under my bed upstairs, was currently running the final simulations for a supply chain model that had just been valued at a six-figure licensing fee. The sensory details of that night are burned into my memory with a photographic clarity. The scent of expensive cigars drifting in from the heated patio, the cold moisture of the champagne bottles against my palms, and the way the light from the Swarovski chandelier shattered into 1,000 tiny diamonds against the polished hardwood floors. My father called me over at one point, not to introduce me to his colleagues, but to tell me that a guest had spilled red wine on the Persian rug in the library and that I needed to find the club soda and fix it immediately before it set. I knelt on that rug, scrubbing at a stain of $500 Cabernet, while two men discussed the importance of legacy and the way children are a reflection of their parents' investment. I realized then that my father didn't want a daughter. He wanted a trophy that affirmed his own greatness, and since I wasn't shiny enough to put on the mantle, I was relegated to the floor. The $25,000 they were burning through that night could have paid for 2 years of my education at a state school, but they chose to spend it on 3 hours of social validation instead, proving once and for all that their priority was the mask they wore, not the people behind it. I felt a strange, quiet power in that moment of absolute humiliation, a realization that the lower they pushed me, the more momentum I would have when I finally decided to rise. I didn't engage in their games, I didn't argue when my mother critiqued the way I was holding the serving tongs, and I didn't flinch when Jessica made a joke about me being the new maid. I was a scientist observing a dying ecosystem, a coder watching a system crash in slow motion while I had the only backup of the essential data. My plan for the exit was already finalized, down to the minute. The private car I had booked to take me to O'Hare International Airport would arrive at 4 a.m. on the morning after Jessica's rescheduled orientation, and by the time they realized I was gone, I would be halfway across the country. The lease for the Cambridge apartment was already secured with a deposit of $6,400, a sum I had painstakingly scraped together from my secret savings and the first installment of my fellowship stipend. I had already packed my essentials into 2 high-density tactical duffel bags that were hidden in the back of my closet, containing my laptop, my external hard drives, my legal documents, and the few items of clothing that didn't smell like the diner. As the party wound down and the last of the executives were ushered into their waiting black SUVs and Mercedes-Benzes, my father pulled me into the kitchen, his face flushed with the success of the night and the several glasses of scotch he had consumed. "Chloe," he said, his voice thick with a condescending warmth that was more insulting than his anger. "You did a good job tonight. You really showed that you can be useful when you put your mind to it. Maybe this community college thing will finally teach you some humility and how to follow directions. And who knows, if you do well enough, I might consider letting you work in the mailroom at the firm next summer." I just looked at him, my expression a blank mask of compliance, and thanked him for the opportunity, all while my mind was screaming with the knowledge that the mailroom of his firm was about to be the least of his worries. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the remnants of their excess, washing expensive crystal by hand and disposing of half-eaten lobster tails, the silence of the house returning like a heavy, cold fog. Family isn't the people who let you serve them while they celebrate their own reflection. Family is the people who pull up a chair for you at the table when you have nothing to offer but your presence. I climbed the stairs to my small room for the 91st time, the weight of the $92,000 secret finally beginning to feel like a shield rather than a burden. And I knew that the next time this house saw a celebration, I would be the one the guests were talking about. But I wouldn't be there to hear it. The countdown had reached its final stages, and as I closed my eyes, I could almost hear the sound of the trap snapping shut, a clean, sharp noise that would echo through the empty halls of my father's colonial long after I was gone. The evening of my father's 60th birthday bash was a masterclass in the kind of performative opulence that defined the Vance family, a sprawling sea of $2,000 custom-tailored Italian wool suits and the heavy, cloying scent of expensive Cohiba cigars that drifted like a toxic fog through the high-ceilinged rooms of our Lake Forest colonial. The air was thick with the hum of high-stakes networking and the practiced, artificial laughter of people who measured their worth in quarterly dividends and social capital, while I was forced by my mother to move through the crowd like a silent, invisible ghost. Susan had been very clear about my role for the night, handing me a silver serving tray and instructing me to circulate among the guests with bacon-wrapped scallops and miniature Wagyu beef sliders, ensuring that I didn't linger long enough for anyone to actually look at my face or ask me a single question about my life. I felt the cold weight of the sterling silver tray against my palms as I navigated the tight clusters of billionaire clients and marketing executives, people who reached for the appetizers without once making eye contact, treating me as nothing more than a functional extension of the catering staff. My mother had even insisted I wear a plain, high-collared black dress that she had picked out specifically because it was forgettable, a garment designed to blend into the shadows of the walnut-paneled library so as not to ruin the aesthetic of her $15,000 kitchen renovations or the carefully curated image of her golden daughter, Jessica, who was currently draped in a shimmering $3,000 designer gown. By 9:15 p.m., the atmosphere had reached a fever pitch of self-congratulatory arrogance as my father, Richard, stepped onto the third step of the grand mahogany staircase, a crystal glass of 18-year-old Macallan Scotch held high in his hand like a scepter. The light from the Swarovski chandelier overhead shattered into 1,000 tiny, jagged diamonds against the polished wood and the gold-leafed frames of the oil paintings, casting a regal glow over him as he began his customary toast to his own success. He stood there, the undisputed king of his $4.2 million annual billing empire, and began bragging to his most prestigious clients about Jessica's upcoming prestigious internship at a top-tier consulting firm in Manhattan, a position that he had personally manufactured with a secret $15,000 donation to the firm's favorite educational foundation just 2 weeks prior. He spoke of her resilience, her intellect, and her bright future with a paternal pride that was as thick and syrupy as the wine the guests were drinking, all while Jessica stood at the base of the stairs, nodding with a modest, rehearsed smile that hid the fact she had failed out of her previous university and spent her tuition on Gucci handbags and trips to Cabo. My father was at the absolute peak of his arrogance, basking in the collective admiration of the 50 influential executives he had invited, truly believing that he had successfully buried my potential and secured the legacy of his favorite child through sheer financial force and manipulation of the optics. It was exactly in that moment, as he was mid-sentence describing the visionary leadership qualities he claimed to see in Jessica, that the sharp, insistent chime of the doorbell cut through the smooth jazz quartet playing in the background. The sound was a jarring intrusion into the carefully orchestrated symphony of the evening, a sudden break in the rhythm that caused a few heads to turn toward the heavy, iron-reinforced front door. My mother frowned, her eyes scanning the room for a servant to handle the interruption, but since I was already near the foyer with my tray of empty appetizer picks, I set the silver platter down on a marble console table and moved toward the entrance. When I pulled open the massive oak door, a blast of the 22-degree Chicago winter wind swept into the warm, scented foyer, carrying the bite of Lake Michigan and the smell of impending snow. Standing there, shivering slightly in the frigid night air, was a FedEx courier in a dark purple uniform, his breath visible in the cold as he held a rigid purple and orange priority overnight envelope that stood out against the darkness of the porch like a warning flare. He didn't care about the $2,000 suits inside or the $60,000 party in full swing. He simply looked at his handheld scanner and stated in a flat, tired voice that he had a delivery for Chloe Vance that required a direct signature. The envelope was heavy and stiff, the kind of cardboard mailer that signaled the arrival of something permanent and legally binding, a document that couldn't be ignored or deleted with a click. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was almost electric, a sharp contrast to the dull, aching numbness I had been cultivating for the last 92 days as I played the part of the broken, community college-bound servant. I took the electronic pen and signed my name with a steady hand, the first act of true agency I had felt in years, while my father watched from the stairs, his brow furrowed in a mixture of annoyance and curiosity at the disruption of his grand moment. The courier thanked me and disappeared back into the wind toward his idling truck, leaving me standing in the open doorway with the cold air swirling around my ankles and the weight of my future gripped tightly in my hands. I didn't close the door immediately. I stood there for a second, letting the freezing wind wake up every nerve ending in my body, knowing that the trap I had spent 3 months building was finally, irrevocably set to snap shut. Behind me, the party had gone quiet, the guests sensing a shift in the energy of the room as my father descended the remaining steps, his face beginning to flush with that dangerous shade of burgundy I knew so well. "Chloe, what is that?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and the limestone floors, a sharp edge of suspicion cutting through the remnants of his celebratory tone. He reached the foyer and stared at the FedEx envelope, his eyes narrowing as he took in the official markings and the priority overnight status. "It's probably just some more junk mail for your little community college application," Jessica chimed in from the edge of the crowd, her voice dripping with a condescending pity that caused a ripple of suppressed laughter among the nearby guests. "Give it to me," Richard said, reaching out his hand with the expectation of immediate obedience, his gold signet ring glinting under the foyer lights. He assumed that as the master of the house and the holder of the FAFSA signature I supposedly lacked, anything that came through that door belonged to him first. I didn't hand it to him. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step back, the cardboard of the envelope crinkling slightly under my grip. The guests were all watching now, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension between the powerful marketing mogul and the daughter they had spent the evening ignoring. I could see my mother's face in the background, her expression one of growing horror as she realized the optics of the night were beginning to unravel in front of her most important social contacts. Richard's hand remained extended, his fingers twitching with an impatience that bordered on rage. "I said, give it to me, Chloe," he repeated, his voice dropping into that low, threatening register he used when he was about to exert his total dominance. "You're making a scene in front of our guests, and I won't have your dramatics ruining this evening." I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the fine lines of aging around his eyes and the hollow desperation for validation that drove every one of his $4 million billing cycles, and I realized that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The man who had threatened to bankrupt my future to pay for my sister's handbags was nothing more than a bully in an expensive suit, and I held the weapon that would dismantle his entire reality. I slowly tore the perforated strip at the top of the envelope, the sound of the cardboard ripping like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled out the thick stack of high-quality linen finish paper, the gold-embossed crest of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology gleaming at the very top of the letter. I didn't need to read it. I already knew every word by heart from the digital copy I had been studying at 5:15 every morning, but I wanted them to see it. I wanted the 50 influential executives and the billionaire clients to see exactly what kind of asset my father had tried to discard. As I unfolded the pages, the first thing that caught the light was the official fellowship award letter, detailing the $92,000 in fully funded tuition, research stipends, and housing allowances. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the faint hum of the sub-zero refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. My father's hand dropped to his side as he saw the crest, his face turning from burgundy to a pale ashen gray that made him look every bit of his 60 years. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the first few lines of the text, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish as he struggled to process the information. It says MIT, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the collective intake of breath from the crowd. Jessica's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock as she realized that her golden child status had just been eclipsed by the sister she had spent years mocking. The prestigious internship my father had just spent $15,000 to buy for her suddenly looked like a plastic participation trophy compared to the merit-based, fully funded fellowship I had earned in the dark. I stood my ground, the cold wind still blowing in through the open door behind me, feeling the industrial bleach on my hands and the old canola oil in my pores being washed away by the sheer, cold victory of the moment. This wasn't just a letter. It was an eviction notice for the version of me they had tried to create, and as I looked around the sea of expensive suits and frozen faces, I knew that the Vance family's perfect narrative had just reached its final, unscripted chapter. "Family sacrifice is an interesting concept, Dad," I said, my voice clear and unwavering for everyone in the room to hear. But I think I've sacrificed enough for a family that never even bothered to learn my name. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had obliterated the cage entirely. The moment of impact did not happen in the center of the ballroom under the shimmering Swarovski crystals, but in the sterile, brightly lit silence of the kitchen, where the scent of expensive catering and Taj Mahal quartzite predominated. My mother, Susan, had snatched the rigid FedEx envelope from my hand as I walked toward the back of the house, her face a mask of annoyance and suburban irritation as she assumed it was merely another country club invoice or perhaps a late bill for the $25,000 birthday bash she had so meticulously orchestrated. She stood near the sub-zero refrigerator, the industrial hum of the high-end appliance providing the only soundtrack as she tore into the cardboard with her manicured nails, her mind likely already pivoting back to the guest list and the optics of the evening. I stood exactly 3 feet away, watching the muscles in her neck tighten as she pulled the thick linen finish paper from the purple and orange mailer. I watched her eyes scan the gold-embossed crest at the top, and then I watched the color drain from her face so rapidly it was as if a plug had been pulled at her feet. Her knees hit the polished marble floor with a sickening heavy thud that echoed off the custom cabinetry, the sound of bone-meeting stone vibrating through the room, and for a second, she simply stayed there, collapsed in a heap of silk and pearls, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I stepped forward with a calm that felt like ice water in my veins and took the paper from her shaking, limp hand, the heavy weight of the MIT acceptance letter feeling like a literal weapon in my grasp. I didn't offer her a hand up. I didn't whisper a word of comfort. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen, through the arched transition, and straight into the grand living room where the 50 most influential executives in the city were still gathered in clusters of $2,000 suits and expensive cologne. My father, Richard, was still positioned on the 3rd step of the grand mahogany staircase, his Waterford crystal glass of Macallan 18-year-old Scotch held aloft as he continued to bask in the glow of his fabricated narrative about Jessica's prestigious future. "Attention, everyone," I called out, my voice cutting through the smooth jazz quartet and the low hum of corporate networking with the sharp, cold precision of a diamond-tipped blade. The room went unnervingly still as the music stuttered to a halt, the cellist's bow dragging across the strings with a faint, discordant groan before silence reclaimed the space. All eyes turned toward me, the invisible daughter, the girl in the plain black dress they had ignored all night. As I stood in the center of the Persian rug, the light from the chandelier overhead illuminating the gold seal of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for everyone to see. I didn't wait for my father to speak, though I could see the confusion on his face beginning to morph into a panicked, defensive rage as he recognized the letterhead in my hand. I began to read the letter aloud, my voice steady and resonant, carrying into every corner of the 5,200-square-foot colonial. "Dear Chloe," I began, the words echoing off the oil paintings of fox hunts and the $16,000 crown molding, "we are pleased to inform you of your admission to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a full Turing-Bowers Fellowship. This prestigious merit award, reserved for the top 0.01% of applicants, will cover the entirety of your $92,000 in annual costs, including full tuition, a research stipend, and all associated living expenses in Cambridge." I paused for a heartbeat, letting the sheer, staggering weight of that number, $92,000, sink into the minds of the men who measured success solely by the bottom line of a balance sheet. I looked directly at my father, whose face underwent a horrific transformation, shifting from a dangerous burgundy red to a ghostly translucent white that made the broken capillaries on his nose stand out like jagged red lightning. I turned my gaze away from him and addressed his clients directly, the CEOs and hedge fund managers who had spent the last 3 hours listening to him brag about his marketing brilliance and his golden daughter's fictitious internship. "My father told me I was too stupid for this," I said, my voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register that seemed to command even more authority in the suffocating silence. He tried to withhold his signature from my financial aid, and he even went so far as to demand I transfer my $10,432 in hard-earned savings to pay for my sister's expulsion from her previous university, a debt she incurred while buying Gucci handbags and vacationing in Cabo on his dime. The shock in the room was palpable, a physical pressure that seemed to make the air grow heavy and cold as the polished veneer of the Vance family was stripped away in front of the very people my father spent his life trying to impress. I looked back at Richard, who was gripping the mahogany banister so hard his knuckles looked like white stones, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound emerging. "But data doesn't lie, Dad," I added, the words feeling like the final nail in a coffin I had been building for 3 months. "You spent $25,000 tonight to celebrate a lie, while I built a future out of the silence you tried to bury me in." The silence that followed my declaration was so absolute, so deafening, that it felt as though the entire house had been plunged underwater. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant sound of the wind rattling the heavy oak front door. Then, the silence was shattered by a sharp, crystalline explosion as a guest in the front row, a man who sat on the board of a major pharmaceutical company, accidentally dropped his crystal flute of Dom Perignon. The glass disintegrated upon impact with the dark hardwood floor, sending shards of light and expensive champagne spraying across the rug and the shoes of the people nearby. But no one moved to help or apologize. They were all staring at my father, their expressions shifting from polite interest to a mixture of profound embarrassment and corporate disgust. They had just witnessed a man try to dismantle his own daughter's genius to cover for his other daughter's mediocrity. And in their world, such a lapse in judgment was the ultimate sin of leadership. My father's hand began to tremble, the amber liquid in his glass sloshing against the rim as he stared down at me from his elevated position on the stairs. But he looked smaller now, as if the Tom Ford tuxedo had suddenly grown 3 sizes too large for his frame. He tried to find his voice, his throat working convulsively as he searched for a way to spin the narrative, to regain control of the optics that my mother had worked so hard to maintain. "Chloe, let's go into the office and discuss this privately," he finally managed to croak out, his voice thin and desperate, but the invitation came far too late. The executives were already beginning to set their drinks down on the marble consoles and the quartzite island, their body language signaling a collective, silent exit. They didn't want to be part of the wreckage. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water, and my father was the one bleeding. I watched as the CEO he had been laughing with just 10 minutes ago adjusted his silk tie and began to move toward the door without saying a single word of farewell, a silent condemnation that carried more weight than any shouted argument. Jessica was standing near the fireplace, her $3,000 gown suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had been canceled mid-performance. She looked at the MIT letter in my hand, and then at the shattered glass on the floor, her eyes wide with a realization that her $10,000 infusion of my savings had been a temporary stay of execution that was now officially over. The fellowship meant I was untouchable. It meant that his threats to withhold his signature and his documentation were legally and financially irrelevant. I was no longer the invisible disappointment or the waitress who smelled like industrial bleach. I was a Turing Bowers Fellow, a title that carried more weight in the world of high-level logistics and data science than my father's entire marketing firm ever would. I felt a surge of triumph that was so pure it felt like a physical heat, a glowing coal in the center of my chest that finally burned away the last remnants of the shame they had tried to instill in me for 28 years. As the room continued to empty, the guests moving toward the valet stand in a hurried, awkward procession, I stood my ground on the Persian rug, the acceptance letter held firmly at my side. I thought about the 14,000 lines of code I had written while the house was quiet, the hours I had spent scrubbing grease traps at the rusty spoon and the metal box hidden under my floorboard. Every moment of humiliation, every insult about my community college brains, and every forced hour of serving bacon-wrapped scallops had been the fuel for this specific fire. Family isn't blood. Family is a meritocracy of the soul, and by that metric, I was the only Vance left standing. My father remained on the stairs, a broken monument to his own arrogance, while my mother remained on the kitchen floor, the sound of her quiet, rhythmic sobbing finally beginning to drift into the living room. I turned my back on both of them and walked toward the front door, the cold Chicago wind waiting to welcome me into a life where their names would never be spoken again. I had spent my life as a rounding error in their calculations, but tonight, I was the only number that mattered. And as the last guest vanished into the night, I realized that the silence wasn't deafening because of the shock. It was deafening because for the first time in my life, there was finally enough room for me to breathe. I walked out into the 22-degree night, the shattered crystal behind me a perfect metaphor for the family I was leaving in pieces. And I didn't look back even once. I walked out of that massive, hollow house in Lake Forest with nothing but a single tactical backpack slung over my shoulder and the $10,432 that I had reclaimed from the wreckage of their expectations, leaving them standing in a silence so thick it felt like the onset of a winter storm. I didn't look back at the 50 influential executives who were already murmuring in the foyer, their polished expressions of corporate respect having dissolved into looks of profound, clinical distaste as they realized the man they had come to celebrate was someone who would systematically sabotage his own flesh and blood to protect a fabricated legacy. As the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, the 22-degree Chicago wind felt less like a bite and more like a long-awaited baptism, washing away the lingering scent of industrial bleach and the heavy, cloying smell of my father's expensive cigars. I left them there to explain to the city's most important power players why their invisible daughter was headed to the best technological institution in the entire world with a full $92,000 fellowship, while their golden daughter, Jessica, was revealed to be a pampered fraud whose only real talent was spending money she hadn't earned. The optics that my mother, Susan, had spent $15,000 on kitchen renovations to protect were officially shattered beyond repair, lying in pieces on the hardwood floor alongside the shards of that dropped Waterford crystal flute. 6 months have passed since that night, and the distance I have put between myself and the Vance name is measured in more than just the 900 miles between Lake Forest and Cambridge, Massachusetts. I officially blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles the moment my train crossed the state line, ensuring that their frantic, late-night attempts to apologize or manipulate the narrative would never reach me again. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that my father's marketing firm lost 3 of its largest multi-million-dollar clients within 48 hours of that birthday party, because as it turns out, billionaire CEOs and hedge fund managers do not like doing business with a man whose personal judgment is so catastrophically compromised that he would try to bankrupt his most gifted child. The $4.2 million in annual billing he used to brag about has withered into a fraction of its former glory, a direct consequence of the truth walking into a room and refusing to leave until the lights were turned out. My mother's social calendar has reportedly gone empty, the charity auction committees and country club luncheons suddenly finding themselves overbooked whenever her name is mentioned, proving that the status she valued over her own daughter was as fragile as the silk table runners she used to obsess over. I am currently sitting in the Hayden Library at MIT, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Charles River as it flows with a dark, steady purpose toward the Boston Harbor. The light reflecting off the water is a cold, brilliant silver, echoing the clarity I finally found when I stopped seeking permission to exist from people who were determined to see me fail. My name is Chloe Vance. I am 28 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not a variable in someone else's equation or a footnote in a corporate marketing strategy. I have a perfect 4.0 GPA in one of the most rigorous graduate programs on the planet, and my proprietary supply chain algorithms are currently being reviewed by 3 different venture capital firms for a potential seed round that could dwarf my father's entire life's work. My desk is no longer a scuffed laminate surface in a drafty 120-square-foot bedroom. but a sleek, functional workspace surrounded by the brightest minds of my generation. People who judge me by the elegance of my code and the depth of my logic rather than the brand of my hoodie or the scent of my workplace. The $3,200 rent for my loft in Cambridge is paid for by the merit of my own intellect, and the groceries in my refrigerator were bought with money that was never subject to a family sacrifice or a mandatory meeting. I have replaced the 10-year-old Honda Civic with a deep, personal sense of security that no luxury Audi Q5 could ever provide, and I have found that the silence of a library is infinitely more comforting than the silence of a house where you are being ignored. I look at my hands now, no longer red and raw from industrial cleaners, but steady as they move across the keys of a high-performance workstation that I earned through sweat, grease, and 14,000 lines of secret code. The betrayal that happened at 7:04 p.m. on that Tuesday evening was the greatest gift my father ever gave me, because it stripped away the last lingering delusion that I owed my loyalty to a biological coincidence. He thought he was closing a door on my future, but he was actually just removing the walls that were keeping me from seeing how wide the horizon truly was. Watching the crew teams row across the Charles River in perfect rhythmic synchronization, I am reminded that progress is a matter of consistent, quiet effort rather than loud, arrogant proclamations. My sister Jessica is likely still sitting in that 5,200 square foot colonial, clutching a Gucci handbag that no longer carries the weight of a social status she can't afford to maintain, while I am building a reality that they can't even begin to touch. The $92,000 secret is no longer a secret. It is the foundation of a life where I am the architect, the engineer, and the sole proprietor of my own worth. I have learned that family isn't the people who share your DNA while treating you like a burden. Family is the community you build when you finally decide to stop being a casualty of someone else's ego. I don't need a signet ring or a mahogany table to know who I am anymore, because the data of my life has finally aligned with the truth of my potential. There is a profound philosophical peace in knowing that your value was never theirs to decide, even if they spent 2 decades trying to convince you otherwise. The $10,432 I saved from the diner was the most important investment I ever made, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented, a refusal to be erased. I am no longer the invisible disappointment. I am a high-functioning anomaly who broke the system that was designed to contain her. As the sun begins to set over Cambridge, casting long amber shadows across the stacks of research papers and technical journals, I realize that the most powerful thing you can do to the people who tried to break you is to succeed so thoroughly that your name becomes a reminder of everything they lost. I am done being a cautionary tale for the Vance family, and I am finally, undeniably, the hero of my own story. My father wanted me to stick to flipping burgers, but instead, I used the heat of his disdain to forge a future that is as cold, as hard, and as beautiful as industrial steel. Standing up from my seat, I pack my belongings into my bag, the same one I carried out of Lake Forest, but it feels lighter now, as if the weight of their disapproval has finally evaporated. I walk toward the exit, my footsteps echoing with a confidence that doesn't need a Waterford crystal toast to validate it. I am headed toward a meeting with a professor who actually listens when I speak, to a home where I am the only one who defines the optics, and to a tomorrow that doesn't require anyone's signature but my own. The world is vast, complex, and filled with variables that my father's marketing firm will never understand, but I am no longer afraid of the math. I am the solution to the problem they didn't even realize they had, and as I step out into the crisp Cambridge evening, I know that the most realistic thing about my life right now is that I am exactly where I was always meant to be. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the truth is, I was always the strongest one at that table.